in the very beginning, you talked about you did some personal studies with telepathy and things like this. What were some of the conclusions you found during those studies?
That it works.
That's amazing.
It works to the extent that I was kind of an acolyte or a follower, a friend really, of somebody who was more full-time involved in it. And I don't know if you've heard about this, but starting about, I think, at the start of the 1970s in the USA, the secret services or the military at some level started to pick up that they were years behind the Soviets, who were they were training people to use psychic powers, and they'd been doing it for years. A book came out, I think, in 1970 in the West called Psychic Experiments Behind the Iron Curtain, and it scared the CIA stiff because the Soviets were obviously years ahead. The West wasn't doing anything. So they quickly started getting into it, and what they found out, they started working with known psychics, and they would ask them to try to spy behind the Iron Curtain and to see what was happening, to describe technological progress being done in secret, to describe underground facilities, what was happening there. And it worked, but Ingo Swann was one of the main people, a great psychic of the time, very capable, but he said, anybody can do this. And he said, get some volunteers. I think he said, get some volunteers from the military, just ordinary GIs from any branch of the military, or let them volunteer, or you just assign them and I'll teach them what to do. And he just took seemingly normal people and taught them how to do this. And the effects were extremely efficient. And they had spy satellites up in the air, of course, but the psychics were able to describe in much more detail what was going on. And the program kind of officially came to an end after maybe a decade, but it didn't really. It carried on secretly. And this kind of work was going on in the Stanford Research Institute under the military financing. And it was extremely efficient. And there's all kinds of, there's books on this you can find. And it was so efficient that it was more effective than spy satellites. But spy satellites, there's billions and billions of dollars into producing them. And so there's a suspicion that the psychic programs were closed down because they were so cheap. And industry was missing out on creating all these satellites. That was their income. And they didn't like the fact that they were being outdone by the psychics. But there's example after example. President Carter, it slipped out one day. He said that it was a Soviet plane which had crashed in the jungle in Africa. And they couldn't, and of course they were very interested to get their hands on this plane because they can see what Soviet technology was like, but they couldn't find it. So they brought in their psychics, found it straight away. The helicopter landed within, I think, 100 yards of the crash. And local natives were coming away with parts of the plane, you know. They were told exactly where to go. But if you read books on that kind of work, it really does work. And I had experience with people working under me just as an experiment. And I also had a little bit of experience as somebody doing it. And I'll give you an example. this is not spiritual at all. It's just how things can work, which are not physical. My friend, who eventually went off to the Stanford Research Institute, when he was still in England, I visited him one day and he said, would you like to try one of these experiments? I said, sure, yeah. The method he was using was called the Gansfelt Technique. And I think it's a German word. And I think Gansfelt means something like amorphous or white. Anyway, what you do is to take sensory impressions away as much as possible. So you're not thinking of what you can see, what you can hear. So I went upstairs in his home. He was downstairs. And I lay on a bed, and what you do on the Gansfelt technique, it was a technique being used quite often at the time. You wear headphones, and the headphones have white noise, and the white noise kind of puts you into a receptive mood, just white noise. And for the vision, it's incredibly cheap. You just get a ping pong ball, cut it in half, and put the two halves over your eyes, and then shine a light. So all you can see is white light, and all you can hear is white noise. And so it puts you into a dreamlike state where you're very receptive. And there was no input from down below where he could speak to me. But whatever I said, he could hear, and it can be recorded. So once I was receptive enough, I thought, okay, and he could hear me. I said, right, I took maybe 10 minutes, and I said, oh, I'll start now. And just about immediately, I got the impression of something white. And it was something white. It was quite large, like I'm doing this. And then pretty quickly, I got the impression it was concave. It had a depression, a very definite depression. So it's white, it's concave. And then very quickly, I got the impression that it was smooth. You could run your hand over it, and it was like porcelain. It was very smooth. And I got all this within 1 or 2 minutes. So it was white, it was concave, it was smooth. And then the intellectual mind kicks in, which is it's a real problem when you're picking up impressions. And I said, it's a sink. It's a sink. And he said, do you want to, he kind of came up and said, do you want to come downstairs and see what it was? Because he'd been downstairs as the sender, sending the impression, and I was the receiver. So I went downstairs, and there was something, and I must emphasize, I'd never seen it before in his home, never. It had never been in a place in the home where I'd been. So it wasn't something I'd unconsciously seen either. But he had a candle, which was about 12 inches in diameter, a white candle, and it had been burned a lot, so there was a big depression in it. And of course, it was smooth. I guess he might have been running his fingers over it. So it was white, it was concave, it was smooth, and that's how accurate it can be. But when I was doing experiments with other subjects and they were doing it under me, it was amazing, some of the results we got. There was one lady, and her task was to pick up the impression of a picture. And somebody else, apart from me, had 20 brown envelopes. And there were 20 completely different pictures, which I'd chosen and put into 20 envelopes and shuffled them. So even I didn't know which was which. And a third person had to pick one out like a playing card open it, and totally alone in another room, they had to look at it, and that was the target. Now, once it was all over, it turned out the target picture was a winter forest. So it was lots of trees going vertically up in a forest. It was in winter, so there was snow all over the ground, and the sun was shining through the trunks of the trees. Now, even if I was looking at that photo in front of me, all I would say is, well, it's trees, it's a forest, it's winter, there's snow, the sun is shining through the trees, and it must be cold, and you can see the silhouettes of the trees. That's all I would think of saying. But the lady who was picking this up in a different building altogether, she went into incredible detail, in detail I wouldn't even have thought. And that's how accurate it can be. So, do psychic abilities exist? The answer is yes, but you don't have to be gifted. People like the psychic Ingo Swan, he said anybody can learn to do this. Some will be better than others, but he reckoned he could teach anybody.
Wow. Yeah, actually, I have a good friend of mine who I'm going to see later today. He was in the Navy, and he told me that there are people, that's their job in the Navy, is to do exactly what you described from that book, is that they're just like radar for the military, and they describe exactly locations of specifics, just like you explained. But I don't think he's even aware of that book. He just knows people's back.
Is that now in the present day?
Yeah, that's now.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's obviously they. It sounds to me like they didn't want anybody to know about that, but that's apparently happening right now. I mean, he told me this not too long ago. There's people that's their whole job in the military. That's all they do. They just sit in a room and visualize locations, and they're like scouting, just like you said, like surveillance. And
so you see what they do. When a program like that becomes known about publicly, they announce that it's been closed down. And maybe it is, but they open another one up because they want it to be secret. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize it was still happening now. Wow.
Is there any other type of psychic abilities that you've experienced or aware of in your search through searching for gurus and these spiritual people and things like this, like levitation and telekinesis and all this stuff?
My friend that I worked with, he worked with that was what he did a PhD in psychokinesis, and he used the same methods that the Victorians used in their spiritualism, where they used to sit around a table and the table would start to levitate and move around. And there's a famous documentary because a group in Toronto in the 1970s learned to do this, and the table would have they actually invented a fictitious ghost, and they called it Philip, and gave it a character. And it was not anybody real who passed on, but it gave a character. And what really happened, which I didn't want to be involved in, because it involves what's called ectoplasm, which comes out of your body, out of every person. And the ectoplasm forms a kind of invisible form. And the form then can raise the table and move it around. But it's like mixing your blood with other people, because the ectoplasm that goes out from you mixes with them. And then what comes back could well be a mixture of everybody's ectoplasm back into you. So I didn't want to get involved in that. But it was on TV in the 1970s. This group in Toronto, they were interviewed. They had the table there, and the interviewer was up some stairs, and this table walked up the stairs to him. They had their hands on the table, but only on the top. But the table was walking up the stairs, and they weren't touching underneath it at all. And that was called Philip the Ghost. And it's on, there's videos of that happening. And my friend did it with a group as well. And he put some scales underneath the table, and the scales weighed the amount of weight that was coming out of their body to create ectoplasm. And then it was like a piston pushing the table up, and he could measure how much weight was there. And he actually told me he took his hands away from the table, and nobody else realized, and nobody was touching underneath it, but it's still raised. But he left all that kind of research officially because he thought he was going over to the USA to do intellectual scientific research for the betterment of mankind, because it was interesting. But then he found out more and more that it was a military budget, and all they were interested in was, how can we use this for the military?
Right.
So he quit. That's as far as I know.